Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. This is professional real estate investor David Campbell from hassle-free-cashflow-investing.com, and I am joined by a fantastic expert in a very specialized field that every real estate investor needs to know about, and that is Steve Hodgon from modernassetmanagement.com.
Hello everybody.
And I'm really excited that you all took some time out of your day to learn about this very, very important concept. So just briefly about myself, I have been a professional real estate investor for over a decade, licensed real estate broker, and have owned and managed both commercial and residential properties. And one of the things that always comes up is tenants don't always pay what they're supposed to pay. Anybody surprised about that, right? And when they don't pay, you need to have an awesome team to help you collect from those tenants that have made a decision not to pay. And so it's a very specialized field of knowledge, and I think I found one of the absolute best people in the industry to educate us on this topic. Very uniquely qualified gentleman who's got both collections experience as well as landlord experience. Steve owns property, and he has been a professional property manager in the past. So Steve, tell us a little bit about your background in real estate and in collections.
Okay, David. I collected my first bad check in December of 1980, working for a department store when I was very young, thinking that it was only a part-time job, and it turned out I was good at it, and wound up going through the steps of management there, leaving that company, working for a credit card bank, and then buying a collection agency that I operated for 17 years. I left that business in 2005 and ventured into debt purchasing, buying and selling default judgments and credit cards and all manner of receivables. And I also at that time owned a consumer-based property management business in Palm Springs called the Rental Connection, doing vacation and traditional property management. I also have been for the last 6 years the owner-manager of a C-class shopping center in the Denver suburbs, and have learned an awful lot about that I thought I knew everything about doing my own evictions, and well, as it turns out, even I can be fooled.
Fantastic. So we're going to just talk today about collections and the tenant application, and when your tenant is late, what you do, how do you collect, or how do you behave as a landlord or a creditor during an unlawful detainer action or eviction process, how to get a judgment, how to collect your judgment, and then once you have your judgment, how do you monetize that? You could either collect it or sell it, or et cetera. We'll talk about that. We're talking about risk mitigation and lowering the liability to landlords. And this event is really designed for smaller landlords and smaller property managers, right? Whether you own residential or commercial property, if you're a huge company, oftentimes big companies have their own collections department built into their property management firm. But if you are not big enough to have your own collections department on staff, then this is a great webinar for you. The whole idea about today is building relationships, sharing ideas, sharing opportunities that you may not have known were available. This is not a sales pitch. There's nothing for sale today. And it's very important that you remember that this is not investment, tax, or legal advice. This is not a substitute for getting your own professional advice. Even though Steve and I are professionals and we've held different licenses and designations, this is not advice specific to you. So make sure that you get your own competent legal, tax, and professional advice specific to your situation. And just because you're watching this video, there's no agency relationship created. And big, bold statement, just because we're nice and we're giving away a free webinar, don't sue us because you used the information and screwed it up somehow. So just briefly, hassle-free cash flow investing is about getting more profit with less money, time, and hassle invested. And one of the big parts of hassle is tenants. So how do we get more profit with less hassle? A big part of mitigating hassle is just knowledge, and having the knowledge of what to do now to avoid a problem in the future. And a lot of what Steve is going to share with us today is about how to set up your applications, how to set up your processes, how to buy certain properties that are going to result in more likely collections. So if you can improve the probability of your collections in the future with less hassle, that's a great benefit. Also, if you do have a judgment, many people already have people that owe them money. If you already have someone that owes you money, where if you've gotten a judgment to collect from that person, Steve can share with us some great information about how to monetize that judgment in a very hassle-free way. So stay tuned. Also, at the very end of this presentation, we're giving away a few ebooks. And so if you want to stay to the very end of this presentation, we'll share with you how you get these free ebooks from our faculty. And so hang in there. Some great information today. So Collections 101. It's not if your tenant will default, it's when your tenant will default. And something amazing that Steve taught me is that paradigm shift, that when I lease a property to a tenant, whether it's a commercial tenant or a residential tenant, I'm extending credit to that tenant. And I never thought about it that way. And how do you, Steve, how do you underwrite a tenant in such a way, knowing that eventually you're extending credit to them as the landlord, and how are you extending them credit in a way that you're improving your opportunity to collect from them in the future?
Well, it starts with a good, thorough application. It should be, if you're renting residential, it should be a complete separate application for each tenant that's over 18 years old. And you're looking for stability. What you're really looking for is stability. Why you want to know why they came to you? What made your property the magical home that they're looking for? I've been in this market where it's been a renter's market and been an owner's market, and I've seen desperation. I've seen so many owners whose properties are on the brink of default take any tenant they could get to make their next mortgage payment, only to have that tenant default almost immediately and then them lose the property after all. An application is only as good as it's verified. I like to look at people in the eye. I like to look at people in the eye at 7 in the morning. You can tell an awful lot about a person by knowing where they were the night before. And at 7 in the morning, people it's like they're applying for a job, and they should show up that way. If they're unwashed, if they're hungover, if they come up in a car that's fallen apart, that's what your property is going to look like when you have to take it back. So it's not a $800 a month decision. It's not a $10,000 a year decision. It's a $100,000 decision, because you're giving them a home that you likely own have a mortgage to, and the bank is not going to say, well, it's okay, you don't have to pay your mortgage, because they're such nice kids and they're going to catch up soon.
I really like that concept, because many people, including myself, have thought about, well, I'm trusting this tenant to pay me an income stream, and that isn't entirely true. You're entrusting that person with the entire value of your property, right? Because they could destroy the property, they could not pay the income, they could cause liability to the neighborhood, which extends to you as the landlord. So it's a huge decision about who to let into your property. So let's just look at a very high level about what collections is about. So what are creditors' rights, and what are some of the things as a landlord that you want to be informed about, so that when you talk to your tenants, number one, you're not violating any type of credit laws, and two, things that a landlord should know to give them power to do their job well.
Right. Well, I certainly hope everybody is using a lease. I really don't like the idea of month to month rents on the eviction side. It makes it more and more difficult. The lease has terms that protect the lessee and the lessor, but that doesn't mean that the contract has to be written completely unilaterally equal for both sides. It can certainly favor the landlord and include clauses, late fees, restrictions, access to property that are right up to the edge of the law, so that you can make sure that your property is being taken care of for the time that it's in the basic ownership of the person who's renting from you. The lease is the tool that is used to enforce your enforce collection of rent, and it's the tool that gets you the judgment. What I see so often, particularly in the individual landlord, and I'm speaking from my own personal experience, is that I start to break my lease when somebody gives me a story. The dog's sick, we've lost the job, all the myriad of things that happen to people in life. And once I break my own lease by not enforcing payment, by making some other exception, I've created a path where the whole lease is invalid. So I start with tenants now, and I sit down and I make sure that we see literally eye to eye, and I tell them I'm really tough on due dates. My note to the bank is due on the 5th. If I'm late, I have $1,000 penalty, and I can't afford to pay that $1,000 penalty, so I need your rent on the 1st.
This is really important to have that written document, right? When you loan someone money, of course you're going to sign a promissory note before you get that money. And when you're giving someone the ability to live in your property, I know it seems common sense to say that you should have a written lease, but I have seen it so many times where people let someone into their property. Maybe it's a family member where you just thought, oh, well, it's my friend. Oh, it's my family member. We can just, move right in without a lease. But remember, it's not if your tenant will default, it's when. It's when that relationship's going to go bad. So that lease is, think about it as your promissory note, because it's the tenant's promise to pay. And what Steve was talking about is if you aren't enforcing that lease, it could be construed that you're modifying the terms of the lease, right? If you always let your tenant pay, 20 days late and you never make a fuss about it, eventually, because that pattern has continued for so long without dispute, it could, consult your own legal counsel, but it could be construed that you've modified the terms of your lease because of your behavior.
Right. So there's various ways that tenants break leases and various things that you can put in. You can put in quiet enjoyment. You can put in no cars on the lawn. You can put in no business done in the home. You really need to have a clause in that says no one over 18 can stay in this property that is not signed and approved on their own separate application. What happens in California is David and I share an apartment. David moves out. I slide another roommate in. I don't tell you, the landlord, and then now David's replacement now has full rights of tenancy, and I have to go through an eviction process to remove him, and I have no benefit of a lease that gives me standing in court to do the same.
Yeah, I had the situation very recently in real life where, fortunately, it was in Texas, and I had a good lease that did have that clause in it that you just mentioned. But the grandmother filled out the application, and she had a perfect credit score and great income history. And then, lo and behold, we discovered that the grandma was not actually living in the property. It was her granddaughter that had taken possession of the property. And we said, well, this granddaughter needs to fill out an application. And they pitched a big fit. No, it's the grandma. She signed the lease, and we'll look at the lease. The lease says anyone over 18 must fill out a lease application. So we twisted the arm of the granddaughter to fill out the application. And of course, the granddaughter had a felony, which is why she didn't want to apply for the lease in the first place. And then that gave us the ability, if the granddaughter had filled out the application, of course, we would have denied the tenancy. Right, but this was a very important clause that I encourage every lease to have.
Absolutely. One of the other things to consider and at least have in your lease, whether you're prepared to do so or not, is I really like to take payments via ACH now by an electronic means. Collecting paper checks is going to become a thing of the past completely. But it's the main benefit is right away if the payment's no good. You do your ACH on the 1st, and on the 2nd You don't have to wait for a 5-day return from the bank. And that 5 days is the difference between you getting your rent collected. Excuse me. You're getting your rent collected, or that rent money going to pay some other necessity of life that the renter has.
Yeah, when they deposit their check on the first, you want to be the first one in line to get paid. So there's kind of three parts to the money. Well, let's not quantify it. One is making sure that you're extending credit to the right person and making a good credit decision. The second is managing your lease and your tenant relationship so that you can avoid collections. And Steve had a great idea about ACH. And the next is if you don't get paid, then you want to get your collateral back. And we're going to talk about that in depth a little bit later. And then the final thing is after you've gotten your collateral back, you're going to get a judgment, which is even though you have your collateral or your property back, they still owe you the money. And so we'll talk about what a money judgment is, which is that document that says the tenant still owes you. So, Steve, this is a great statement that you have that you say a lot, which is your tenants will look like the property you buy.
Right.
And so one of the things to consider, you're saying, well, it'd be good to collect your rent via ACH. Well, there's some tenants that don't have bank accounts, and they live in the kinds of properties that you can imagine someone without a bank account would live in. And so if you're trying to reduce hassle in your investments, because the less hassle you have, the higher your return on investment is, then you want to buy properties that have the kinds of people that have bank accounts, that kinds of people that own vacuum cleaners, the kinds of people that know how to change an air conditioning filter, and they will actually have the money to change an air conditioning filter,
okay,
etc. The kinds of tenants that can afford a phone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're trying to collect from a tenant, it's good that if you can talk to them, right?
Sure.
So what else do you look for when you're profiling a property that you want to buy because you're trying to profile a tenant type, right? Because we're going to start with the property, and the property is indicative of kinds of the tenants are going to show up.
Right. So it's a balance that depends on your appetite for, David's word is hassle. There's a lot of money to be made in doing habitat housing. There's been renting to lower income folks and doing Section 8 government payments. Take that to the extreme of operating weekly boarding houses. There's great margin in that. But there's an awful lot of heavy lifting and brain damage that happens in trying to keep track of all those comings and goings. I moved into commercial real estate, hoping that would be an easier process, and it is. Not having somebody live in my property is helpful, but it makes me more exposed to changes in the marketplace, and so I wind up with higher vacancy than I would if I owned single family residential. The class of tenant is again just that. I want to do business with people that if I met them on the street, I wouldn't cross the street to stay away from them. So you have to be careful, and that's not to say that you can't rent $700 a month houses to solid blue collar working class folks, but just know that their life is going to have lots of ups and downs, and you have to be ready both with patience and financially to weather the storms that they go through.
Yeah, class of tenant, just my personal investment philosophy, I really like commercial property because I can do B2B, business to business type of communications and transactions. I also like owning middle class housing, lower middle class housing, because the people there, they probably could afford to buy the home, but there's something usually on their credit or they're transient enough that they can't buy the home. So I've got a relationship with someone, my tenant, who is going to behave towards the property similar to an owner occupant, right? And they probably care about their job. They probably care about their credit history. They have a little bit of financial acuity so that when they sign a lease, they understand what it says. I mean, when I used to own lower income property and manage lower income property, I would have a tenant sign the lease, but I knew that they had no idea what it said and they couldn't afford legal representation. They were just signing a lease because that's what they had to do to get into the property. But then there was no way that they were going to follow the lease because they didn't know what it meant. They could barely read, right? So I like owning newer property. I like owning middle class houses because I know that those tenants are going to be easier to collect from in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Awesome. So improving your collections with the application. This is pretty awesome because imagine when your tenant defaults, what kind of information will your collection agent want to get the money from the tenant who defaulted?
That's right. So it's I give people a 3-page application. I want a little mini profit and loss statement. I want to know the license plate numbers of their cars. I want to know 3 references. I want to know where they work and the physical address. I want them to fill out the banking information completely. I want them to write the bank name and the bank address. If they can't complete the application, if they can't take the time to fill it out in full and accurately, I think I found that that's indicative of how serious they are about paying the rent. Right? So that all that extra information, although it seems esoteric and not useful at the moment, is absolutely useful on the back end when they're delinquent.
And if you've got a very low income property, my personal experience from having managed that asset type is most of the people don't know how to fill out the application. And knowing, from the school of hard knocks, that I didn't want to try to collect from that socioeconomic of a person in the future, I moved my caliber of home up higher, right? So I want to own nicer properties, more expensive properties, still that are cash flowing, right? You can still, if you're buying in states like Texas or Florida, or et cetera, you can still get nice properties appealing to middle class families that still cash flow. But when that tenant comes in and they can't fill out the application, that's a big challenge for me.
And in that application, when you put your application package together, there should be the full application for each inhabitant over 18 years of age. There needs to be a copy of their driver's license, needs to be a copy of their pay stubs, and a copy of their bank account, so that they've shown you that they've proven that they have stability. And the phrase we have in the slide here is, I was operating a property management business when everything just went to heck in a handbasket, and we had desperate landlords who were doing everything they could to sign in their homes, and I can't think of but a handful of leases we executed in that time that actually went full term without any trouble. So if you're using a property management business, you give them conflicting messages. You give them the message that I need a tenant today, but really the message is I want a quality tenant today. And that's the job that they should be doing, and they should be weeding out people that you may take because their experience says that they're going to be trouble.
Yeah, if you take a tenant because you're desperate, you're just delaying your desperation.
And here's a quick little takeaway on the last slide. Is on the last bit there is, where did they live before? Calling the current landlord is not going to get you an accurate reference. If they're 60 days past due with me, I'm going to tell you they're a great tenant so that they leave me and go and pass on my trouble to you. Talk to the landlord in the place they stayed prior, because he's now been through his problem with them, or he had a good experience with them. And then you're also going back and checking on what their life was like a couple years ago.
It's also really easy to Google the phone number of the person that they give as their reference, right? If they said, hey, I was staying at such and such an apartment complex, and then you Google the phone number they give you, and it's not that apartment complex, that's a red flag to keep looking into.
I call the references while they're sitting there in front of me. And I've had people stop me and say, oh, no, don't call that number, because it's not a real number.
Yeah. That's good. So what kind of documents, if you're, because Steve, you are a collection agent. If I wanted to give you a judgment for a tenant, what kind of documents would you want with that judgment to help you collect and make my collection more likely to happen? Because those are the documents you're going to want to collect from the tenant when they apply. Because once you have the problem, good luck going to your tenant and say, oh, I know you owe me, some back rent. Could I get your driver's license and your other information? Because they're not going to give it to you.
So I want the original application. I want copies of their driver's licenses. I want copies of bank statements. I want copies of payroll stubs. And I want any subsequent update to an application. If your lease says, whenever you are in default, I require a new application, we want that new application too, because it'll show the thread of changing from one job to another, of the cell phone changing from one to another. And again, you have to verify each time. When they've defaulted on their lease, they're 5 days late, 10 days late, whatever the rule is that you choose, that at that time, look, things have changed apparently. I need you to update this information.
Yeah, think about when you're applying for a mortgage, all of the documentation that your lender wants and why they want it. For example, your lender wants copies of pay stubs, partly to verify your income, but partly because if you stop making your mortgage and they have to go take you to collections, or they foreclose and they get a judgment against you, they want to give your pay stub to the collection agent so that the collection agent knows where you work, so that they can get potentially garnished wage garnishment. They can go to your employer and get your employer to pay that judgment, etc. So, Steve, let's say I made an application. I collected an application for my tenant. I collected a lot of documentation. I did get a signed lease application, and my tenant is late. This is going to happen to every single landlord on the history of the earth, right? They're going to have a late payment from a tenant. So, what do you do when the tenant doesn't pay?
The first, and there's not much on this slide, it's enforce the maximum late fee. Don't give away anything. Don't bargain. Don't fall for the sob story. Don't because, and again, 30 plus years as a bill collector, and I used to make my living screaming at people. But when it came to managing property that I owned, I suddenly became Santa Claus. And it has never worked. It has never worked. And so I now believe that the contract says what the contract says. You agree to it. I understand things have changed, but you agreed to this, so I need you to do that. I want to be known as not a bad guy, but I want to be known as firm and somebody who stands on his position. So that I understand they can't pay the rent today. If you're going to take a short rent payment, it has to be today. I'll pay you next paycheck. What happened in their life that their current paycheck was more important than the roof over their head? And this is something that's changed quite a bit in the last several years. It used to be that people would always pay their mortgage and they would always pay their rent to the detriment of any other bill that they owed. But with the economic downturn, and it's suddenly being fashionable to walk away from your mortgage, and many of your tenants will be people who have walked away from mortgages, that paying rent becomes optional. The only bill that really gets paid now for sure is the car, because they need the car to go to work. Everybody else can wait, because the auto company or the buy here pay here lot isn't going to give somebody 30 days or 60 days of grace. They're going to come hook the car and take it away as soon as the payment's delinquent.
There's a couple of reasons why to enforce the lease. One is it's just a contract. You agreed to do something, which is to provide clean, safe, affordable housing. They agreed to do the things in the lease. And so it's a bilateral agreement, and you need to hold the other party accountable to that agreement. And as Steve has said before, it's training your tenants. You're training your tenants to behave in a certain way, and you want them to pay on time. So the reinforcement of pay on time is you enforce the late fee. Here's another really, in potentially, you might not have thought about this as a consequence, but let's say I have multiple tenants. This would be especially bad in an apartment complex or multi-tenant building where your tenants know each other and talk. But let's say tenant A is a particular race and they don't pay their rent, and you say, that's okay, I'm going to waive your late fee. And then tenant B has the same situation and they're a different race, or fill in whatever protected class it is, right? And then you enforce the late fee against them. Now you've created discrimination between the two tenants, and maybe your intention was, well, I just had a really heartfelt, relationship with this tenant, and that other tenant was just trying to, take advantage of me. Whatever your opinion, whatever it was, every tenant is different and is going to have a protected class, whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's religion, whether it's, whatever it is. If you treat your tenants differently, you've created a liability for yourself. So always enforce the terms of the lease.
And when they've defaulted and they're coming and they're going to pay you back, and you get your new updated application, verify that too, and making sure that there is continued proof of income. If they went out and borrowed the money from dad to pay the rent this month, you don't know that that money's coming in next month. Mm-hmm. So another point is every state has a different set of rules, but most follow something along the line of a 3-day notice to pay or quit. And it's the initial eviction notice. If you use 3-day notices, mean it. Don't teach your renters that a 3-day notice is a collection letter. Right? You have to file one, but when you file one, file it because you mean it. That your intent is to take back that property unless you get rent in full within the prescribed time in your state.
Tell me why you like calling your tenants at work when they're late.
Well, whenever somebody's in trouble, they're going to, let's say, fudge the facts. You have a cell phone number, you have reference numbers, you have a landline number, if they still have a landline. I like to call people during my normal business hours, which are 9 to 5. And I like to call people at work because it's convenient to me, but I really like to call people at work to find out if they're still where they said they were. Right? They could tell you, hey, job's tough, I've been laid off, and well, lo and behold, they're at work. Or they're telling you that they just had a problem and they're going to catch up next payday, and they're not working. So you want to know that. When you do get a consumer on the phone, or you see them in person, the best initials, this is probably one of the better takeaways you'll get today. The best initial collection demand is to simply ask, what happened? And then be quiet and listen. Let the renter give you all of his excuses, all of the reason why it's the world's fault and not his, and make sure that he knows that you heard him. And then bring him back to your conversation. And that's controlling, that's in a collection call. You give the consumer respect that he doesn't get anywhere else, and make sure that he knows you heard him, and then say, well, that's fine, but I still have to get paid because I have people that I have to pay.
So let's talk about some of the do's and don'ts of calling a tenant at work. For example, when you call at work and it's the receptionist that answers, I'm guessing you don't say, hi, this is Steve, I'm trying to collect a judgment against Bob Smith. Can I talk with Bob because he hasn't paid me in a long time, that deadbeat.
And right? that collection agencies are sued under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. Last year, there were, I think, 14,000 federal lawsuits filed against bill collectors for exactly that and lots of other violations. While you are an individual, if you're an individual landlord, you may not believe that you're held accountable to those laws, but you are, because you're operating a business. So we approach consumers the work call is hi, hassle-free cash flow investing. Hi, this is Steve Hodgon. Is David there? No, I'm sorry, David's not here. Oh, do you know what time he'll be in? No, I don't. Okay, thank you. Or yes, he'll be in at 3. Okay, great, thank you. Or let me connect you. Wonderful is the best answer. Never ever ask a third party to act as your debt collector, including passing on messages to call back well, in my business, it would be callback Acme Collections. Never ever do that. When you call references, it's the same thing. You're calling your references, trying to find David. Is he there? No, he's not. Do you have a number? Yes, I do. Or no, I don't. Not, can I give you my phone number and ask you to have him call me? You've now extended and made that person a debt collector for you.
Yeah, fantastic. So let's say it's gotten to the place where you gave them the 3-day notice to pay or quit, and that's the beginning of the eviction process. You're telling the tenant, I want you to pay or I want my collateral back. I've given you credit. You didn't honor that credit agreement. I want my collateral back, which is my property. So you start the eviction process or the unlawful detainer action. How do you interact with that tenant, and how do you approach collections during that period?
Well, you're going to build from your what happened collection conversation, where you're going to know what he said his circumstances are. And as you move through that process, you're gonna make a decision. You're gonna say, am I gonna ride this all the way to the end, or do I want my property back as quickly as I can? I've paid tenants to move out when I know that I have no chance of collecting any money from them, that they've got drug issues, that their life is completely upside down. I've paid them to move them out. I've rented the U-Haul to move them out. Get my property back and make a better decision next time. You have to weigh the cost of what it costs to evict in your state. California is very expensive. The first thing that happens in an unlawful detainer action in California is the tenant gets at least 3 months free rent.
Mm-hmm.
That's a number one. They get at least 3 months free rent. At minimum, you've got a $400 out-of-pocket expense for court costs, plus the charge for an attorney. It's an eviction, depending on where you are in the state, is anywhere $1,500 to $3,000 in expenses to get back.
Plus the lost rent.
Plus the lost rent.
Yeah, yeah. That's one of the reasons I really, really like Texas. And I'm looking at the state's laws because the state and their law system of law is a partner to mine in my investment. It's because in Texas I can get a tenant evicted in, if I'm really on top of things, in 30 days, but realistically it's about 45 days to get a tenant out of the property. That's to get the keys, right? To actually show up and have the tenant gone. They missed the rent on the first of the month. 45 days later, I've got the keys to my property back.
Right. And at the time that they stop paying rent, your relationship with them has changed. They're no longer your friendly landlord. They're no longer my nice landlord Dave. You've now become the bad guy, even though all you're doing is enforcing your lease. There'll be more damages. There'll be countersuits. There's just lots of brain damage that happens. So at each step in the collection in the court process, at each step, we want to call, text, email, knock on the door, and we want to ask, what's it going to take to get you to leave? Right? Do you want to go today and save all this trouble? Do you want to go today and save the hassle? Do you want to go today and save me chasing you for the next 20 years on getting my money back?
Yeah, a good point of leverage that I've used in the past with a tenant is if they leave today, I've got a chance to get my property re-rented. And I usually say leave it in good condition, right? Leave it clean. And the thing that the tenant gains is maybe I'll forgive the rent that they have owed because it's not cost effective to collect that amount of rent anyway. The second is if they go the distance for an eviction, it's going to show on their credit as eviction.
That's right.
And the second is all of the costs of eviction are added to the judgment. So they're going to incur 2 to 3 times the amount of rent they owe just by not paying it and not moving out.
So at each step in the process, you need to make a demand. And if it's not in your personality type to make a demand, well, the property manager will do that for you. If you're not using a property manager,
you should be.
Yeah, you should be. You should consider it if you want to be in the hassle-free world. I've done both. But what is a good demand? A good demand is a threat that also has a solution. That you want to explain what the next pain point is going to be, or the pain point that they're in now, and you want to offer them a way out.
Yeah, that's good. Good, good, good. So let's say it went the distance and I had to evict, and then I get the writ of possession, which is the sheriff shows up and gets the tenant out of the property. I have my collateral back. That's not the problem. The problem is the tenant owes me a bunch of money, both because they didn't pay the rent, they didn't pay the court costs, and now they didn't leave it clean. So I've got to get this property fixed up and rent ready. And I may have a security deposit from that tenant, but I haven't. I need to apply that security deposit to my damages or to my costs. So a really important thing to do to remember is even though you've got a possession of your property back, you need to still give the tenant a disposition letter that says, here's what I did with your security deposit, here's what you still owe me. Because in many cases, if you haven't given your tenant a disposition letter within the statutory time period, believe it or not, the tenant is entitled to their security deposit back, even though they might owe you money, right?
Okay.
Because you didn't follow the statutory disposition disclosure requirements.
So always, always, always get a money judgment.
So what is a money judgment? I mean, how do I get one?
Well, what you've applied for is an unlawful detainer action is to reclaim your property, and in some venues it can stop there unless you specifically ask for a money judgment. So at the time that you're getting possession of your property, you're going to know back rent and you're going to know your costs to get to that day in court. So you ask for that, and then depending on state law, I use a 10-day rule that in the next 10 days, I submit to the court and to the consumer a final accounting, adding all the damages, repairs, stolen fixtures, and all the costs. Allowable items are court costs, attorney's fees, cost of process of service, publication if that was required. Contingency fees to collection agencies are not allowed. There is in each court a standard that allows for depreciation on paint and carpeting. If the tenant had been in your place for 10 years, you can't bill them back, generally can't bill them back for repaint and carpeting. If they'd been in the place for 6 months, well then if you put new carpeting in the day they moved in, well then they owe you some money for damage to the carpet. But it's always ask at the time that you get your judgment for the opportunity to submit a final accounting. And that can be significant. I've seen units where the tenants have stripped out the kitchen cabinets, they stole the toilet. And,
Yeah.
At that point, we have to make a stand.
And the point, at the sake of being redundant, I just want to make sure everyone in our audience knows getting your property back, that writ of possession, is different from getting a money judgment. You need to do both, right? And in some courts, they can kind of fast track them and do them simultaneously. And in some courts, you have to make a second appearance to get the judgment, the money judgment, and the writ of possession separately. And sometimes there's a second filing fee to get that judgment.
And usually, you don't have the renter there. Usually, they don't appear. But when they do appear, 5 minutes before we're going into court, I'm still trying to work a deal. I'm still trying to get them to look. You owe me $3,000. I'll take $50 a month for the next 10 years, whatever it takes. So you can walk into court and say, Judge, Your Honor, we've solved this amicably. These are the terms that we want to enter onto the calendar as final record. That I will save the tenant his having a judgment against him, and take a stipulation that says he's going to turn over the keys on Friday. He's going to leave the place clean. He's going to pay me for any damages, and he's going to pay me X amount in rent and costs and all of that. And in lieu of for that, he's going to make X amount of dollar payment per month. And if the consumer keeps his bargain, he saves having the judgment rendered against him. If he fails, I'm allowed to secure my judgment without any further due process. He waives his legal rights from that point forward.
Okay, so now the judge has given you a judgment against the tenants, a money judgment that you can now go collect from the tenant. How do you collect? How do you turn that piece of paper from the court into money in your pocket?
Well, in the hassle-free world, you're going to give it to somebody like me. either through a sale or through placement on a contingency basis. If you're attempting to enforce a judgment on your own, you need to be aware that probably the consumer has more experience at this than you do. It's usually not their first rodeo. You weren't the lucky guy who caught them the first time that they fell off the economic cliff. It depends what your state allows. If you've done a good job keeping information up to date, if you know where they are, if you've listened in that first collection call, then you've got some ability. In Texas, you cannot attach wages. In California, you can. Trouble is, usually in California, in California, attaching wages, because that's where my experience is, I'm almost always in second position because there's a family law judgment ahead of me for child support or alimony. You've got to look at from your original application, what other assets do they have? Do you want their car? Do you want their boat? Do you know where they bank? Well, can you put in a bank levy? If they work for tips, and can you seize the tips at the restaurant? That's a different kind of attachment order than a wage levy. Then if you really, really want to get into the nitty gritty work, which is what I do, there's a process called orders of examination. And in an order of examination, the bonus question, I guess we're getting close to the time when people start to think about questions. Does anybody know what the phrase subpoena ducis tecum is? And maybe somebody out there does. Do you know, David?
No, I
Oh,
don't.
good. I know something David doesn't know. Now I'm not going to tell you. A subpoena ducis tecum is a subpoena, which is a request for the court for production of records. And when I want to talk to somebody post-judgment in court, it's a court filing that says, I want to do an order of exam, and you ask the court to summon the debtor to you. And if the debtor fails to appear, then you can sometimes, in some courts, get a bench warrant for their arrest. And that doesn't mean the sheriff is going to go out and pick them up, but it is something that gets reported to the DMV, and they're not going to be able to renew their driver's license or something similar to that. In the subpoena ducis tecum, I want to know all the things that we wanted on the original application. I want banking information. I want copies of tax returns. I want to know, do they have a cable bill? I want to know all manner of things. And I've done hundreds and hundreds of these over the 30 years that I've been in this business. And most of the time, they don't bring any money. But sometimes just the threat of a production of records produces a check.
Yeah, because if let's say you subpoenaed my records, I'm going to have to, under penalty of perjury, tell you where I'm working and give you all of my information to show you where the pot of gold is buried.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. And I've found all kinds of little gems doing that. And just going through the keys on somebody's key ring, I found a boat.
Wow.
I found a boat. And somebody who couldn't pay a hospital bill, I had a boat. But anyway, there's differences between the states. In Georgia is wonderful for consumers. I don't know how they've still been able to keep this going. There's a thing called a FIFE in Georgia, and Fiera Facia document gives you the ability with one court filing to lien personal property, automobiles, residential property, and do a wage garnishment at the same time.
Wow.
And it's $15.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah, so the big takeaway is every state's collection laws and creditor laws are radically different. And so you can make a decision about what property you want to own by how favorable those laws are.
And just know that most of the time, a high percentage of the time, you're going to strike out. They didn't pay the rent because they couldn't, and they likely still can't.
Yeah. One of my big takeaways, the more I talk with Steve, is realizing this is a very deep, specialized field of knowledge, and that I don't want to try to collect judgments on my own. I really want to take this judgment that I received as an asset, and I want to somehow put it in the hands of a professional to use all of their bag of tricks to get that judgment to be paid by the creditor. By the debtor. So there's really two ways to make that hassle free. One would be a judgment sale, and the other would be like a contingency where someone is going to,
assigning the account to an attorney or a collection agent.
yeah, can you tell us about those two and the pros and cons of either just selling your judgment up front for cash or assigning that on a contingent collection basis?
Well, um, I buy paper of all different sorts, and my intent is to execute all the things that I know how to do over a long period of time, recoup my original investment, and then make some profit. And in buying judgments, I look to buy large volumes of judgments because I know that I'm looking for lightning strikes. I'm looking for, 2 or 3 out of 100 are going to generate some income, so I have to price those things accordingly. But the value of selling a judgment today is 1, 2, 3, 4 cents, and what that does is they get you money in your pocket today. And if you know your consumer and you know that you can't think of any way that they could possibly pay, then selling a judgment is probably a good idea. If you want to be hassle free, get rid of the paper, put a little money in your pocket, move on. If you want to ride it further, then you're going to do the things that I do. You're going to take that account, you're going to assign it to a collection attorney, and you can do that. You can do that through us at Modern Asset Management. And then you're going to have to ride along in that process. There may be additional costs that you're going to have to write a check for to take actions and do enforcements. Nothing with the court system is free, and in California, costs they've tripled in the last several years as that system has run out of money. So when you assign account, if you're going to choose a collection professional, you want to make sure that you've chosen a collection professional who is that mix of big enough to have all the tools and small enough to actually pay attention to your account. If you're assigning 1, 2, 10, 20 accounts to a collection agency, you're going to be a very small client, and you're not going to get a lot of hand-holding. You're going to know that they don't get paid unless you get paid, so you know you're walking down the same road together. But they're not going to stop everything that's going on in their 10 or 20 person shop to have everybody hunt for Joe Smith who burned you for $1,000.
Yeah, one of the reasons I really like just selling your judgment and moving on, one, it's a return on time. The sooner you get the money, the more that money is worth. The second is just the emotional cost of hanging on to that baggage, right? Very oftentimes, by the time I get a judgment from a tenant, I've already assumed I'm never ever getting paid. So if I get one penny by selling a judgment to someone, I'm infinitely farther ahead than if I had gotten anything, right? Or nothing.
Frankly, I've been doing it so long, so I'm kind of got a thick skin about it. But this isn't work you're going to do if you want people to like you. This is tough. This is nitty gritty. This is all the things that you think of in the collection world, and this is the bottom end of the collection world. This is the worst of the worst. People who don't pay for their habitat, and it gets treated accordingly. And the conversations are not. I'm not going to say they're not threatening. They're not illegal, but they're certainly adversarial, and they're not pleasant. And it takes a certain type of person to do that.
Yeah.
And the guy who's buying a home to build toward his retirement, our audience, you're not cut out for you guys are too nice for this kind of work.
Yeah. So let's talk about what a landlord can do in advance to make their judgment more valuable. How do I get the top dollar for the judgment once I get it by planning ahead?
The closer to the eviction date, the more valuable they are.
So act quick. That's the takeaway. If you've got a judgment, the quicker you sell that judgment, the more it's worth.
Every little shred of information that you ever gathered, there's a jewel in there that you didn't know what you were looking for. Sometimes in the phone record, in your list of phone numbers, there'll be a reactivated phone number at a reference that somebody will be mad at Dave and say, "Oh yeah, I know where he is. Here's his phone number."
They wouldn't be mad at me though.
Well, no, of course not.
Yeah,
but the credit worthiness of the debtor today is important. Where the debtor is located is important. Again, I can't attach wages in Texas. I can in California, but it's expensive and takes a year. That's why I love Georgia, New Jersey, New York. Judgments are good forever. The courts are cheap. It's easy to do.
Yeah.
And the location of the judgment. is it in a state that I actually have rules that I can enforce?
Yeah, and so and when we were talking before, the location of where the debtor is, the person, and where the judgment is, where the court was, those are two different locations, and depending on where the person lives and where the judgment is, those could be different values to a person purchasing a judgment. So we're here towards the end of our presentation and just want to give you some action items for you. First of all, if you visit my website, hasslefreecashflowinvesting.com, under the ebooks section, which is /investor-education, there's are some fantastic ebooks, including an ebook by our wonderful faculty member, Steve. And that ebook is called The Modern Collection Call, 8 Steps to Control a Conversation to End with a Payment Agreement. This is really powerful because it isn't necessarily how to become a professional collection agency, but these are really action steps that you can do when you're in conversations with anyone who owes you money, right? To how to control that conversation to end with payment. So if you want to get that ebook, you can visit my website and download it, or you can also send an email to collect@hasslefreecashflowinvesting.com, and we'll email that free ebook out to you right away. If you do have questions about from a landlord perspective, or just any type of a judgment that you have, and you want to get some help collecting that judgment, and you just have questions from if you owe someone money, that's not what we're talking about. But if someone owes you money and you've got questions, send an email to collect@hasslefreecashflowinvesting.com. We'll get those questions to Steve, and he can respond right back to you. If you do have a judgment for sale and you want to get a price or a quote on the sale of that judgment, really send it to collect@hasslefreecashflowinvesting.com. Steve will respond. Steve is his own independent company. We're really just grateful that he shared his knowledge with us today at our audience at Hassle Free Cashflow Investing. Really encourage all of you to visit hasslefreecashflowinvesting.com for future educational events like this. There's tons of educational videos and free ebooks, and also investment opportunities for real estate investors looking for hassle-free opportunities.
I appreciate the time.
And I appreciate everyone on the call for being here. If you do have questions, please send them via email. And thank you so much for being on the call. Today's presentation is being recorded, and if you want to see a replay of it, make sure that you visit hasslefreecashflowinvesting.com, and there'll be a link to that video up on our site. Thanks everyone for attending, and I look forward to your questions. You have a great day.
Thank you. Goodbye.